Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Cronese Mandate in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. The Cronese Mandate mostly overlaps with the old pre-Republic nation of the Cron Kingdom, although a handful of planets have been bitten off and given to the nearby allied Tion sector. The Cron Kingdom was the dominant power of the Tion cluster in the early Republic days, if you even count it as the Republic yet. The core worlds were clearly Republic-esque, but the official founding date is a couple of decades after the conquest of the Cron Kingdom, at the hands of the pirate king Zer, whose son Zim the Despot would go on to conquer the entire Tion cluster and then some, thus forming the Tion hegemony. Zer was a Tianese aristocrat who turned to piracy, for what reason isn't clear, and became so successful that he became head of a pirate alliance with enough captains answering to his flag and treasure in his holds that he captured the remote planet of Argai and then spent 10 years biting off chunks of the Cron Kingdom. The Tion cluster was densely populated even then, so Zer's advance into the Cron Kingdom was done one noble at a time, and those nobles controlled not entire planets, but only small fractions of them. After a decade of nibbling at the Cron Kingdom one castle at a time, Zer had only conquered 4 planets, his native Argai plus Dravion, Corlas, and Panna. This was a phenomenal amount of success for a pirate, and yet also seemed pretty insignificant in the face of the Cron Kingdom, which ruled over a dozen major worlds with hundreds of millions, if not billions, of inhabitants each. The Cronese king tried to buy Zer off with fantastic riches, and that clued Zer in that the Cron Kingdom didn't necessarily expect to win a fight with Zer. That was kind of surprising. Zer ruled 4 planets, and the Cron Kingdom was the dominant power of the cluster at the time. Well, Zer took that bet, storming through the Cron Kingdom and capturing its capital of Chandar. Chandar was one of the 4 thrones of Cron, recognized as the major powers of the Tion cluster, and having defeated the dominant power of the Tion cluster, Zer proceeded to roll through 2 of the other thrones, and Cadenth, one of the 3 allied kingdoms of what would eventually become the allied Tion sector, and Raxus at the end of the Andrexu spiral of what would eventually become the reduced Tion hegemony of the modern galaxy, which is less commonly but more helpfully known as the Kalula sector. Zer also tried to capture Desevro, the 4th throne, capital of the Livian League, but was never able to defeat them before being succeeded by his son, the legendary Zim the Despot, who would complete the conquest of the Tion cluster by defeating Desevro and expanding his empire out to a total of 8 thrones, or 9 if you count Slaheron, the planet that Zim had picked out to be his 9th throne on the northern fringe of Hutt space, but he was either killed or captured while fighting the Hutts for it. Records vary. After Zim's death, his empire tore itself apart, but fairly quickly reconstituted itself into the Tion hegemony, with power shared mostly equally between the aristocratic traditions of the core 4 thrones of Cron, but with Raxus exchanged for Zer and Zim's homeworld of Argai. The outer 4 thrones added by Zim shared some amount of influence as well, although these would not be core Tianese territory. The Hutts would pillage the 7th and 8th thrones in the Kyrium Reach pretty freely, and after the arrival of the Republic in the region, the Hutts would torch the Kyrium Reach completely, including both of its throne worlds, to create a desolate buffer zone between themselves and the potential Republic-Tion alliance, creating the region that is now known as the Ash Worlds. Despite the Hutts' fears, the Tion hegemony was initially hostile to the Republic, which was hemming them in from potential expansion by blazing down the Prolemian trade route, bumping up against the 6th throne in the Thanium worlds. The Tianese War went well for the Republic, but not so well that the Tion hegemony wasn't able to negotiate some pretty generous terms of surrender and incorporation into the Republic as a sector. This was the first time the Republic had a significant expansion outside the core worlds. The Corellian Run hadn't even been blazed out to the Outer Rim at this time, and the Republic had yet to encounter the Arcanus Regency or the monarchies of Naboo or Iriadu, let alone incorporate them as sectors. Just as the Hutts feared, the union between the Republic and the Tion hegemony strengthened opposition to their dominance in the Outer Rim, and this outcome was even worse than the Hutts thought. The result of the Tianese War made it clear that the Republic's heartlands in the galactic core were even more prosperous and powerful than the densely packed worlds of the Tion cluster. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Tion cluster was mostly ruined. Millennia of economic exploitation had turned worlds like Chandar and Aramax into polluted city planets that had once held hundreds of billions of inhabitants until the growing environmental devastation of worlds like Ur-7 and Raxus Prime made it impossible to import enough food, and emigration and a bit of starvation thinned their populations down to what the enervated sector could support. The Tian aristocracy was deeply in bed with the Outer Rim corporations whose exploitations had wrecked most of their planets, and still considered themselves a galactic power on par with Coruscant and Alsaken and the other core worlds of the Republic. To the Tianese, the Republic had been a long and profitable union between the core and the Tian cluster, but one that was now reaching its end as the Republic sought to rein in the exploitation of the Outer Rim by corporations like the Trade Federation, Techno Union, and the Banking Clan. While the Tian cluster was by no means spared from the environmental consequences of this exploitation, they'd also profited from it, especially the aristocrats who could afford estates insulated from the damage on places like Raxus Secundus. The last thing they wanted was to have that income cut off by strict regulations on the exploitation of the rest of the Outer Rim, while still being left to clean up the aftermath of thousands of years of mining and manufacturing in the Tian cluster. The Tian cluster became the capital of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. It was mostly unscathed by the Clone Wars. The Republic's Outer Rim sieges never got past planets like Ossus, Felucia, and Belderone, near but not actually in the Tian cluster. You'd think there'd be more to say about the Clone Wars in a region so dense with history, especially since it was the capital of one of the two sides, but the Tian cluster surrendered to the Republic before their perimeter was breached. They saw other separatist strongholds like Megiddo and Siskine fall, and decided they did not particularly want to be orbitally bombarded into submission, so they gave up without a fight. In order to weaken the Tian cluster and hopefully prevent them from rising up against the core again, the sector was split into multiple other sectors, mostly allied Tian, the Cronese Mandate, and a new reduced Tian hegemony, now called the Kalula sector. Even split three ways, there are too many major worlds to describe in just the Cronese Mandate. The Tian cluster's attempt to be the core of the Rim went really poorly, but it's easy to see why they thought they could pull it off. Arcan 4 is a massive trade center. Kismano is somehow still not completely mined out despite continuous operations since before the time of Zer VIII. Pasman is still a major textile manufacturing center. Nuswata is still home to the legendary Forbidden Gardens built by the Hierophants of the High Fane of Zo. Although the gardens have seen better days, the planet of Corvus has relatively recently begun intensive mining operations during the Imperial era, and with the decline of many other worlds in the region, Abon is considered the most economically and militarily powerful planet of the Cronese Mandate as of the Clone Wars and, to a lesser extent, still today. The fate of all the Cronese Mandate planets is pretty well tied together, and the story of one is the story of the others, but there are a lot of them. The Empire split the Tian hegemony into like 5 sectors, but if they stuck to one major world per sector, they could have made at least 30. Naturally, all of the sectors of the former Tian hegemony greatly resented the Galactic Empire. When the near-Ishbai Calamari space openly rebelled against the Empire after the destruction of the first Death Star, the Tian cluster sectors became a major hotbed of rebel activity. The Empire's efforts to crush the rebellions in Tian were more successful than in Calamari space, but the cluster remained a major thorn in their side for the entire duration of the Galactic Civil War. After Jakku, the Tian cluster got passed around a couple of different Imperial remnants, but none of them could hold on to it, and after decades of struggle against the core, they finally broke free and became independent systems. Today, the Tian cluster is still split between the Cronese Mandate, Allied Tian, and the Tian hegemony, as the 3 newly independent governments can't agree on which one of them is the rightful successor of the Mandate of the old Tian hegemony, and which ones would be subordinate. So, now they're semi-officially the 3 thrones of Tian.